So, what does the average anxious and fearful avoidant relationship look like, and how can two people make this work? The anxious and fearful avoidant dynamic is a common relationship that I see in my work. In fact, it's the second most common dynamic I see next to the anxious and dismissive avoidant relationship. It's also one style that can be very challenging because at one moment it can be very open, honest, and loving, and then the next moment it can be very cold, confusing, and there's a lot of miscommunication that can often take place. To understand this relationship dynamic, you first need to understand the core relationship wounds for each individual attachment style. Anxious attachers typically have core wounds centered around abandonment, or being left alone, perhaps physically or emotionally speaking. This can often result in certain relationship behaviors such as clinginess, neediness, or obsessiveness for the other person, and this can mean that they often lean very heavily on their partners for emotional and physical support. Now, I'm not here saying that these are necessarily bad things. They can be quality traits for relationships. However, when they become triggered and anxious, these traits almost kick into overdrive, where this person needs these areas soothed much more from other people, and they sometimes lack the emotional regulation to give that for themselves. And that is where toxic behaviors can be introduced into the relationship on behalf of anxious attachers. This is where you'll find anxious attachers become hypercritical of their partners, and they may even judge their actions and thoughts, and they may even threaten to leave the relationship as a test of commitment from their partner. In a sense, they almost weaponize their ability and capacity to love other people in the hopes that their partner's behaviors will change, and this often takes the form of guilt tripping. Now, guilt tripping doesn't usually work to create a change in behavior, it just creates more disconnection. Now, don't get me wrong, anxious attachers aren't all bad. They do have a great capacity to love, and they can be very warm for other people. They can be very perceptive and very present. It's just when they become triggered and activated in their relationships that is where toxic behaviors and protest behaviors come into the mix. Now let's talk a little bit about fearful avoidance. Sometimes referred to as disorganized attachment, fearful avoidance have a combination of both anxious attachment and avoidant attachment. They have, I guess you could say, the best and worst of both worlds. And when it comes to their particular attachment style, they have very similar core wounds for each of those independent attachment styles. So for anxious attachers, again, they have core wounds of abandonment, being abandoned or being left alone and feeling unloved. Whereas dismissive avoidance, they more so have core wounds around shame, maybe not being good enough, and beliefs that they don't deserve love and connection from other people. And so that can manifest in a whole different set of behaviors. And so for fearful avoidance, because they have a combination of the two, they can often swing wildly between those core wound sets, sometimes within minutes in relationships. And it is very intense. It's very chaotic, both on the outside and inside. But just because they have these core wounds and they manifest as certain behaviors doesn't mean they don't have a capacity to love. On the contrary, they can be very charismatic people. They can be very outgoing and very present for their partners. They aren't necessarily space cases like how maybe sometimes dismissive avoidance can be when they're deactivating. Fearful avoidance can tend to be very present to their partner's needs. That is until they feel as though they've been betrayed. They felt as though they've been slighted from their partners, and if they can't trust them. Again, the fearful avoidant attachment style, and speaking from personal experience as someone who has mostly healed their fearful avoidant attachment style, a lot of it comes from distrust. Distrust from your caregivers, from your parents. You probably learned at a really early age that you couldn't depend on them for emotional support or physical support or just certain types of support that you really needed at important times, and it left an impact on you. Either your inner child has carried that with you into adult life, or you may have had a great childhood. You've just had really traumatic relationships later in life that have created these same feelings, these same doubts. And for fearful avoidance, they really do suffer from a sense of shame, a sense of guilt for having needs, for communicating boundaries, because they were told that they're not allowed to have those things at some point in time. And they internalize a lot of those beliefs, and they marry those beliefs with their thoughts and their feelings. And that's why they can think that they don't deserve certain things. And there is a lot to this attachment style, but with all of that said, it can often manifest as some really complex and sometimes detrimental behaviors in relationships as well. So when they become triggered in relationships, unlike anxious attachers who might lean on other people for support, fearful avoidants may not actually do that. They may pull away a little bit, and they may rely on maybe some destructive behaviors in order to feel a sense of control, a sense of security. And this is where they can become very hypercritical, perhaps judgmental, and they can say sometimes really hurtful things to really carve out their own space for security, to really repel and push the other person away. And when things like explosive fights happen in relationships, they may say things like they're not good enough for the other person, or nothing they do makes that other person happy. And a lot of this is very commonly associated with anxious and fearful avoidant relationships, because with fearful avoidance, they have a lot of internalized beliefs about not being good enough. And when an anxious attacher comes to them with a particular issue, granted, they sometimes come on very strong and very accusatory, the inner child, or sometimes the wounds for a fearful avoidant, just comes screaming up to the surface and can often result in chaotic behavior where they sometimes lash out on the other person. It's not uncommon for many fearful avoidants to struggle with defensiveness. Very often they've had to defend themselves, whether it was physically, emotionally, or verbally in some type of relationship at one point. And it's a skill that's really helped them to survive. But in most adult relationships in life, it's something that they have to learn to unlearn as they go on. So they certainly have their issues with emotional regulation in relationships, but don't get me wrong, they have a deep capacity to love, just like every other insecure attachment style that exists. It just means that they have some work to do in core areas in order to be in a better place to both give and receive love within those relationships. And this is what makes the anxious and fearful avoidant relationship really interesting, because both sides have a deep capacity to care and love for the other person. I've worked with many people who have dated fearful avoidants who have said that that person was just so loving. They said all the right things. They did all of the right things. And then they seemingly pulled away, and they couldn't understand why, because this person was just unwilling or unable to communicate. And that really is a hallmark of when a fearful avoidant pulls away. And I'll definitely get into that. So when this anxious and fearful avoidant relationship is kind of fresh, maybe kind of new, and is just starting out, they can connect right away. It can be very magnetic, and it can be very deep as well. They can be very intimate, emotionally speaking, very early on. And this is great when you want to get to know someone, but it can almost verge on unhealthy territory where they start opening up about their emotional baggage too soon. And all of this indirectly lays the foundation for chaotic and destructive behavior later on. Both of these attachment styles tend to be drawn to each other because they can become enmeshed and codependent on each other very quickly. They often have very porous boundaries, and they lack certain security within themselves, and so they can naturally lean on each other. And that's why at the beginning of these relationships, there can be a lot of fireworks. There can be a lot of energy, a lot of passion, and a lot of intensity. And because of that, it ends up laying the foundation for really challenging times ahead as this relationship progresses, if it actually gets to that point. Because sadly, many times I see in my work, these relationships don't always get past the initial hump. They don't always get past the phase where they go on to be a long-term relationship. And another thing that's really interesting about both the anxious and fearful avoidant attachment style in relationships is because they can become so deeply enmeshed with each other, they often neglect the other things that help them feel secure in regular life, like friends, hobbies, or passions, or any type of extracurricular activities that prevent them essentially from losing themselves in relationships. So, because they tend to lose themselves in relationships, they can become very triggered as the relationship goes on and progresses. Either it's because the other person triggers them, or just because the natural course of intimacy that plays out is what's triggering each style independently. Now, in my work, when people have broken up from an anxious and fearful avoidant relationship, they often really focus on the disconnection near the end. To them, that is usually the first sign that somebody wants to pull away. But usually, very early on in these relationships, there is an earlier sign where a fearful avoidant begins to pull away that often goes unmissed or just unrecognized. What many people miss very early on in anxious and fearful avoidant relationships is at some point, a fearful avoidant will begin to pull away, but it may not be as chaotic. It may not be as obvious. They may just naturally start to pull away a little bit, and the anxious attacher will actually try a little bit harder to reel them back in. And because the relationship might be somewhat kind of new, people might be a little hesitant to really speak openly about their insecurities and their fears, and maybe call out people when they see changes. So because they naturally act in a way that is designed to get this person to come back into them, I'm speaking about anxious attachers here, they do it in a way where they're not coming at it from the lens of criticism, necessarily overt insecurity. And when anxious attachers take this approach, when they perceive a sudden threat that this person's pulling away, it can actually validate fearful avoidance to come back into that connection. I'll explain. So, say for example, the fearful avoidant pulls away. Rather than the anxious attacher saying, "Hey, what's going on? You're pulling away and I feel insecure," they may just start to try different strategies to get this person to come back in. They may try strategies to set up another date on their own terms. They may just try to set up a time where they can see each other. And if this resonates deeply with the fearful avoidant and it validates them, they might start to feel as though, hey, this feels good. This person's choosing me. Even though I might have feelings of wanting to pull away, it's nice to be wanted. And that is where you'll start to see them pull back toward the anxious attacher. And the reason that this isn't necessarily always a bad thing is because people aren't necessarily engaging with each other based on their intense insecurities. They're still protective of showing up in a certain way that doesn't push the other person away, at least unintentionally. And so because of that, people aren't necessarily unloading their baggage on the other person. They aren't necessarily making the other person the reason for why they feel uncomfortable. And so when it comes to this, the fearful avoidance will feel as though, hey, this person actually isn't necessarily as bad as I may have been feeling. And so maybe I'll come back into this. Maybe I'll really engage with them instead of taking my own space. And this is necessarily sometimes healthy. It is healthy to perceive a sense of space from someone, to feel them pulling away, but it isn't necessarily healthy to say, hey, you're pulling away, it's making me insecure, and it's your job to come back to me. That is where sometimes people who lean anxious can be really difficult to sometimes work with and sometimes difficult to get across to. I say that as someone who has healed their anxious side as well. I certainly used to behave in that way. And so this is why it's really important sometimes for anxious attachers, when they perceive a threat to the security of the relationship, is to sometimes not act so hastily so soon. Sometimes it's good to let people do what they're going to do and to maybe nudge them in the direction you would like them to go in to see if they'll reciprocate. Because many times, if people feel safe that you've acknowledged a sense of space, but you're not necessarily making it a huge problem, they're probably going to want to come back to you with warmth. And so basically what I'm getting at is, like, if you lean anxious, if you find yourself more anxious than avoidant right now, and you notice your partner pulls away, it's really important to maybe acknowledge that, but not necessarily do it overtly in a way where you're assigning blame or guilt. And as someone who's healed their anxious side, I can assure you we do that sometimes. We really do assign blame and guilt indirectly without realizing it. And so it's really important, if you notice a perceived threat to your insecurity, observe that in yourself. Take some time to reflect on it, but then try to be collaborative with trying to pull this person back in, especially if they are a fearful avoidant. And I say this because if we lead with judgment, criticism, shame, and guilt, this only reinforces certain core wounds for fearful avoidance, where they think, see, I was right. This person isn't safe. They aren't trustworthy. When I pull away, even if it's just a little bit, they make me feel bad for doing that. And maybe I didn't communicate that, but it doesn't necessarily mean I need to be treated that way. Now, they may not have the emotional knowledge to communicate that as eloquently as I've just done, but what it does mean is that they're feeling all of those things inside, and therefore they're going to pull away in order to feel safe. So sometimes acting negatively to somebody pulling away isn't going to create the connection you sometimes think it will. In fact, it creates even more disconnection. It creates even more space because of, again, their core wounds, and it only reinforces those. So to really close the gap between two people, you have to better understand their wounds and how they resonate with certain communication styles in order to encourage a change in their behavior. Now, I have worked with many people who had wished they would react in that way. And if you haven't reacted that way in the past, it's okay. You can't change the past. But what you can do is learn and reflect from the past and try to show up differently in the future. Now, if you've noticed a fearful avoidant pull away, and you reacted by using certain strategies like jealousy, like maybe you started hanging out with someone else to get your fearful avoidant ex or partner to feel jealous, or maybe you started talking to your ex, or maybe you just started doing something that made them feel betrayed, you're likely not going to encourage them to come back closer to you. And this is an honest talk with many anxious attachers out there. Not all of them do this, but there are a few out there who rely and leverage strategies like jealousy, like guilt tripping, and revenge to make someone else feel the way they feel in the hopes that it will make that person close the gap between the two of them. And I say this because it's often these types that are leaving some really harsh negative comments about other attachment styles in my videos and other creators' videos, not because they're necessarily bad people, but because as anxious attachers, they equally lack a certain sense of self-awareness about how they show up in relationships. It's almost like the loudest minority that shows up in many videos about attachment theory that is not really trying to heal and understand themselves, but they're just really stuck in a victimhood mentality, which causes them to lash out. And for fearful avoidants who suffer from a wound of not being sure if they should trust other people, either because they couldn't trust their caregivers or somebody genuinely betrayed their trust and it really rocked their core, you're going to see that they don't respond well to certain strategies like jealousy, like revenge, or anything like that that makes them feel like coerced and judged and punished for taking space, whether that space was communicated or not. Because even though fearful avoidants may not be able to communicate this, they understand that even if they take space and it's not communicated, it doesn't necessarily mean that they deserve certain treatment or punishment as a result. And this is a really important thing I had to understand about my anxious traits, because it wasn't until I had that honest conversation about myself that I realized that I could be reactive. And I've worked with many other anxious attachers who do rely on certain forms of reactive abuse to try and guilt trip and motivate people to change for them. And sometimes it's sad to see because they often lack a certain sense of self-awareness to understand that why their certain strategies to get their needs met don't necessarily create connection. It just creates more distance. And in the process, they're left demonizing and villainizing the other person rather than taking a good hard look at how they could have tried a different approach to get the result that they wanted. Now, as I said, that doesn't apply to all anxious attachers. Not all of them are as unhealthy as that. But the ones who have done that, you know I'm talking to you because deep down, you know you've done something like that in the past. And if you are truly willing to work on your attachment style, you're going to acknowledge where you've done that, why it didn't feel good doing that, and why it was unfair to do that to someone else. Because it doesn't matter what someone else has done. No one deserves that treatment. And you don't deserve to do that to other people. So there's no room for that in relationships. So as an anxious attacher, just because you have the innate ability to love and communicate doesn't necessarily mean you don't equally have the ability to hate and retaliate. I'm not saying that all of this is on anxious attachers because, again, fearful avoidance, they have the anxious side as well. They can equally do this too. So this advice applies to anybody that behaves in that way, but especially anxious attachers, because there is a misconception out there that just because they love, they may not cause harm to people. Realistically, at the end of the day, if you have an insecure attachment style, there are some things that you need to work on. You're not any better than anyone else. You're not any worse. We all just have our own shit that we need to own in order to heal. So given all of this, how can an anxious and fearful avoidant relationship work? How can these two people come together to shed their toxic traits and learn to have a healthy, secure relationship? The first step is to become clear and understand the unhealthy ways in which you seek validation from other people and to stop doing those things. This can take the form of protest behavior, as well as jealousy tactics or revenge or threatening to end the relationship. Whatever it is you do, it's time to stop that. You have to take ownership of that, and you have to acknowledge that instead of necessarily doing things like, hey, my ex reached out to me and he was hitting on me and he thought I was really cute in my new selfie. You can maybe say things like, hey, my ex reached out to me. I just ignored it, but it made me remember how happy I am with you. I really do love you, and I'm glad I'm with you instead. Because when something like that happens and you're trying to tell your current partner that your ex had reached out, you're really trying to create connection, but you might be using it with a strategy of jealousy to create a reaction out of them. And instead of using tactics like that to create connection and get reassurance from your person, just come right out and say it. Just be honest with them and just say, hey, I'm really happy to be with you. This person reached out to me. It reminded me how much I love you more and how I'm happy to be where I am now. That is a much healthier way to get validation from someone than to use certain strategies like jealousy or toxicity, because in the end, it just creates more insecurity, more distrust, and more disconnection in relationships later down the road. The other thing is to lead with curiosity, not judgment. And this is one of the things that can be very difficult for all insecure attachment styles to understand. But it is really important to become clear on when we might lead with judgment and shame, thinking we're trying to understand someone rather than just seeking for clarification, seeking to understand. For example, many times people in my comments will ask, if avoidance needs so much space, why do they even bother getting into relationships to begin with? And I can understand how that is still technically a question, but they are not necessarily leading with curiosity, because to lead with curiosity means you also lead with empathy. And it doesn't really, to me, sound like an empathetic question. It doesn't really seem like because they understand they need space, they shouldn't be in a relationship, or because they can understand they have certain needs for space, that it means that they should be single. Another way to kind of phrase a question like that is, because avoidants have space, why do they still have needs for connection? It's a totally different way to phrase that question, because it's the part where they sometimes ask, why do they even bother getting into relationships? That stems sometimes from judgment, that stems from shame. We're all people at the end of the day. We need connection. We need intimacy. Whether we're healed or unhealed, everybody needs that to a certain degree. It is also important to recognize that just because someone may be avoidant or anxious, they will have different needs when it comes to intimacy, time together, but then also other things like their own time alone. And it's really important to understand that this stuff really does lie on a spectrum. Everyone has different needs. And so it's really important whenever we possibly can to lead with curiosity when we perceive a certain threat or insecurity within the relationship. Another example, say you notice a certain imbalance in the relationship. Rather than leading with judgment and shame and complaining about this imbalance and maybe assigning guilt for the other person, you can lead with curiosity by trying to understand, why has there been a shift recently? I notice you don't text me good morning and good night anymore. Is this something you don't want to do anymore? Or is there something else preventing you from saying that? Instead of it being, you don't text me good morning and good night anymore. Why? Do you not love me? You see how those are two drastically different ways to ask a similar question, but one is very primed, one is very judgmental, and one assigns blame. One also assumes the other person's position. To lead with curiosity means you don't lead with any assumption whatsoever. You really allow the person to just show up and be honest and tell you what they're feeling and thinking. The aim with leading with curiosity without judgment and shame is to understand where they're coming from, to better understand what blockages or barriers they might have that are stopping them from engaging in a certain activity or maybe fulfilling a certain imbalance. And with that information, you can strategize with them certain ways to get back to a point that makes you feel comfortable. Or if it's just something that they simply don't wish to be doing anymore, it's another opportunity to understand on a deeper level maybe why. What are their motivations? Are they based on any fears, insecurities? These are all opportunities to connect, but they can very quickly become instances where they result in disconnection because people just react. They show up very emotionally, and it's often based on an insecure impulse rather than trying to lead with understanding and curiosity. Leading with curiosity is a really good way to check your emotions at the door to better understand this person in the moment. And that is a foundational pillar of healthy communication in relationships. Another great thing couples can do to make an anxious and fearful avoidant relationship work is to validate each other's feelings. This does not mean you're just telling your person that when they feel something that they're right, that they are correct, or that their feelings matter more than yours. What it means is that you are making space for their perspective, their emotions, and their feelings to exist equally as much as yours do. All insecure attachment styles suffer to a degree from all or nothing thinking, or what I call black and white thinking. You either love me or you don't. You either want to spend time with me or you don't. If you wanted to, you would. First, being on the receiving end of this type of communication is exhausting. And second, it doesn't actually create more closeness, it creates more distance. Validation truly means you make room for the vast human experience for your partner to exist in the same space as yours, especially if you both have a difference of opinion on a particular issue. It is possible for people to love you and still want space. It is also possible for people to want to spend time with you, but also want their own time alone. And when someone doesn't necessarily do something, it doesn't mean that they don't want to or that they're unwilling to. There are sometimes other reasons or barriers preventing them from doing that. Living by these cliche thoughts and sayings creates more harm in relationships and, quite frankly, sets people up for failure with how they perceive and receive other people. In fact, I think the saying, if they wanted to, they would, has been one of the most destructive beliefs for many relationships. And I've seen it come up again and again with my clients. And it is sad to see because so many people subscribe to this mindset. And really, the world is not that simple. People are not that easy to just sum up in a simple sentence. I understand why some people subscribe to this belief, especially if they're going through a breakup. They need to understand that if somebody wanted to do something, they would, but sometimes people want to do things and they just can't emotionally bring themselves to do it. It doesn't mean that they don't want to. It just means that there are some things blocking them from actually doing that. And what sometimes people don't understand is sometimes they are the reason why people don't want to do things. Another great way that anxious and fearful avoidance can make this relationship dynamic work is by managing your own triggers. It's best to understand what your triggers are, how they show up, and communicate that with your person. Talk to each other about your triggers when they come up, but also ahead of time, because not planning ahead is planning to fail. And so if you're not doing some of this communication before a fight comes up, you're probably going to be in a place where you're just going to react off of each other. You're just going to impulsively say things in the heat of the moment, rather than recognizing, hey, we've kind of talked about this already. Is this what's happening right now? Do you want to talk about this? Did I say something that may have triggered you? I noticed you had a certain type of reaction. Bam. Right there. All great ways to lead with curiosity rather than judgment during a conflict. Now, I understand it's not always easy, but part of understanding your triggers is learning about them ahead of time so you can own them, so you can better show up in relationships when they do come up to the surface. Because just because you heal your anxious attachment style or you work on any attachment style doesn't mean your triggers are going to go away. They will always exist. What matters is that you become better at managing them in the moment. It is truly on us to own our triggers and to respond to them accordingly. Just because someone does something that's triggering doesn't mean they deserve abusive behavior. And vice versa. Just because we do something triggering doesn't mean we deserve to be punished for it. This is a relationship at the end of the day. It's not war. If somebody consistently crosses your boundaries and disrespects you and triggers you, there is no reason to get intense about this, chaotic, and be confrontational. Just simply take your exit and walk away. That is what most healthy, secure people would do at the end of the day. And if you're trying to heal your anxious attachment style, you're not going to run away with your triggers. You're going to recognize that there are opportunities to better understand yourself so you can start to show up differently, not for the other person, but for yourself. This is really about you at the end of the day. The last thing I would recommend the anxious and fearful avoidant relationship do, and this can apply to all relationships, is to embrace the boring side of relationships, also known as learning to settle down. We can get so caught up in extending the honeymoon phase of the relationship, because when the honeymoon phase is over, that's where the real stuff begins. That's where we actually have to do the work to show up and be there for the other person. Just because the honeymoon phase is over doesn't mean the fun has to end. The fun can still continue, but we have to start showing up with emotional availability, with maturity. We have to be willing to just accept that to a degree, eventually we're going to both become comfortable with each other. Just because we're comfortable and we're starting to create a new routine and maybe take our own space for ourselves doesn't necessarily mean we're pulling away. Doesn't mean we love you any less. So if both people in this relationship dynamic can really learn to embrace how to settle down and settle in with each other, they're going to have a much better time at communicating with each other. They're going to feel like they can trust the other person a lot more, rather than maybe trying to extend the honeymoon phase for as long as you possibly can, because there are a lot of people who fear, especially fearful avoidance, that when the honeymoon phase is over, that's where the relationships become so real. That's where they might be seen, rejected, or maybe even betrayed. And if you can learn to trust someone, if you can learn to really settle in that relationship, you're going to have an amazing experience. And this goes for both people. So that's what an anxious and fearful avoidance relationship can look like, provided both people are willing to work on themselves, really take accountability where it matters most, then both people can truly thrive in this relationship dynamic. It's also important to remember that less than 70% of issues in relationships can be resolved. And there is zero room for retaliatory behavior just because someone triggers you. So it is really on us to own our triggers so that we can begin owning our relationships. If you're interested in learning more about anxious or fearful avoidant attachment, then feel free to watch these videos. In the meantime, I hope this video was insightful and helpful. I'll catch you in the next video, and happy healing.